Crosbie, thanks very much for inviting us to your home on a beautiful day here beside Hogan's Pond.
Well, I hope it'll be a pleasure.
I'd like to ask you about people you've met during your political career.
Sure.
Joe Smallwood.
Right. Well, Smallwood, of course, was an extraordinary person, and I knew him quite well because he was a great friend of my father's in the 1930s, and they used to see each other frequently. My father helped finance, or did finance, the books of Newfoundland for him in the 1930s when he was doing the 2 original books of Newfoundland, and he helped finance that and finance the books of Newfoundland. And of course, they didn't sell all that well until the Americans arrived in the early 40s, and that's when Joe started to make money from the books of Newfoundland, because a lot of these Americans bought the books to send back to their families to show them where they were now stationed. And so he and my father knew one another well, and he'd come to the house. Well, after he got involved, Joe got involved in the Confederation movement, he occasionally would come to the house to speak to my father and try to persuade him to support the Confederates. So my father got elected as a member of one of 3 elected in St. John's West, so he was there around all the time of the National Convention. But my father wasn't a natural politician. He was a dynamic and very able businessman, but he just couldn't speak in public. And you know, if you're going to be in politics, you've got to be articulate, able to talk and make speeches, and if you haven't got that, you're not going to advance very far in politics. So it was obvious that he wasn't suited to politics, and when he headed the Economic Union Party, it was Don Jameson and Jeff Sterling who persuaded him that he should. And as you know, Don Jameson became a well-known political figure after 1949, and Sterling, Jeff Sterling is still around at a greatly advanced age, and he still owns the NTV television and radio operations here. So that's how he got involved. They got him involved in it, and I used to meet them. And so I knew Smallwood well, and I knew Don Jameson well, of course, and Jeff Sterling. And as a matter of fact, during the referendum, Jeff had a system fixed up where you could listen to telephone calls going between St. John's and the mainland. And I don't know how it worked, but anyway, they wanted, the purpose of doing this was to try to ascertain, by listening to all telephone calls between St. John's and Ottawa and Canada, mainland Canada, to see who the Confederates were getting their financing from, who it was in Ottawa that they were getting money from, because it was obvious they were getting money from somewhere. And most of the money that they used for the campaign didn't come from Newfoundland sources. And so I was back from school, boarding school, and so and I was working as a laborer up at, they were building St. Clair's Hospital for an echo. And I must say that was tough. The pick and shovel work is really difficult. It was a good experience, but it certainly showed me that I didn't want to be restricted to laboring work the rest of my life. And but it gave me an understanding of what it was like, you know, to be a real member of the working class, and how the endurance they had. You know, men would walk up from Logie Bay and be on the job at 7 a.m. in the morning and work all day, and then return home, walk home. It was an amazing experience. So that's what so I knew Mr. Smallwood through that, and of course later on I knew him even better.
Better in the sense you got to know him very well, and then you
tried
to turf him out.
Yeah, well, my problem was that I wasn't obsequious, and I've never been able to just take orders from other people. You know, there's got to be, I'll do it if it's something I think is proper and sensible, but I don't want to be in any government that's completely authoritarian, and I should have known better than to go with Mr. Smallwood, because it was obvious he had been in power with absolute power. It was astounding for 15 or 16 years. When I first joined his government, ran for him and got elected in the early 1960s. And I mean, I knew the first time I attended a cabinet meeting that I wasn't going to last. I couldn't take it. You had 15 or 16 men, many of whom I thought were very, intelligent and had good reputation, sitting around a table, and no one would say a word until Mr. Smallwood entered. He'd sit down, and then he'd go on and talk for an hour and a half about everything he was doing, and what was happening, say, in the Churchill Falls or whatever the important public business was. He'd talk and go on, keep talking, and everybody else looking around. And if you didn't look interested, or asked a question, or made any comment yourself, you were in his bad books immediately, because by this time he was completely paranoid, having absolute power for all these years. And he would mark you down as somebody who was trying to usurp him, somebody he had to watch, because you were going to be ambitious and you'd probably try to supplant him. It was completely psychotic in that sense. So I knew I wasn't going to last, and it was an unfortunate experience, but all these experiences are good for your character. You all learn from them all.
Let me ask you about another person from that time, John C. Doyle.
Well, Doyle, I knew Doyle as well because of his connections to Smallwood, Mr. Smallwood, and of course when I got active in politics with the PC opposition, we were very suspicious about his activities with respect to the government of Newfoundland and the assistance he was getting for various projects he was supposed to be involved in. The linerboard mill was the worst example, tremendous loss of hundreds of millions of dollars eventually for the Newfoundland government. So I knew Doyle well, but he was a charming man, very entertaining, and he was quite a good musician. And he had an attractive personality.
But he was a crook.
But, oh yeah, he was absolutely crooked. He was as crooked as they could be.
Frank Moores.
Well, Frank, of course, Frank's greatest asset was he was charming. You could not like Frank. He was a very pleasant personality. And his father had a wonderful fishing firm back in those days, and he was involved in that and did well with them. But his charm, and of course he was very much of a womanizer, and
he loved women.
Oh, he certainly loved women. I don't know where he got the stamina, but there you are. We've all got to conserve our strength for something. And but Frank was pleasant, and he got elected in, as you remember, in Trinity Conception in a federal election, and defeated Mr. Tucker, who was the Liberal member there then, and went to Ottawa. And Frank had a lot of luck because he went to Ottawa as elected in the by-election, and at that time the Conservative Federal Party was split between those trying to get Diefenbaker out because he had lost elections and he was a disaster as Prime Minister, and Dalton Camp had the guts and integrity to do what should be done to push him out if he wouldn't leave. So there's that big struggle going on in the PC party. And when Frank went up, and Frank's election in Newfoundland had been big news, and he was a businessman who had managed to survive attacks by Smallwood on him. And so he was immediately attracted to the Federal Party. And the Federal Party had to elect a new president of the party association to replace whoever was there who had resigned, and Dalton Camp was running. Or not Dalton, yeah, Dalton. Somebody was running. The issue was all the Diefenbaker supporters were going to oppose whoever they thought favoured Camp, who they blamed for giving Dief trouble, and the same on the other side. So the party was divided, and Frank suddenly appeared, and he didn't have any background in the party up to that time, and so he didn't. The Diefenbakerites were not out to get Frank, nor were the Campites. So Frank ran for the presidency up there, and he's a charming fellow, as I said, and got the presidency of the Federal Party, which made him immediately, you know, an important figure in the Federal PC Party. And from then on, certain events happened in Newfoundland where the leader of the PC Party down here, Mr. Ottenheimer, got in a bit of trouble, and was felt
This is Jerry Ottenheimer, who also loved women.
Yeah, apparently so. I'm not going to blame anyone that loves women. I love them myself, except I'm too lazy to pursue them, and I suppose that's the reason.
For people who don't remember the Ottenheimer story, apparently he was caught in
a house of ill repute in Montreal.
Had resigned.
Yeah, but Jerry was he was a fine man. You know, we all have our faults. But anyway, he had to resign, and so there was a lot of pressure on Frank to run to replace him, because you know the election wasn't too far off. There'd have to be election in the next 2 or 3 years in Newfoundland. And so he got elected by the PC Party here to become their leader. And by this time, Joey had outstayed his leave, and he had gotten elected in come home year, 1966, and he hung on for over 5 years. I mean, your term is supposed to be over in 5 years, but you can hang on until you're forced by not being able to get money voted for you by the House of Assembly. Eventually, after 5 years is over, you'll have to call an election at some time. And so he called the election after his original 5 years were concluded, and the PCs had a magnificent victory, for the first time a larger popular vote than they'd ever had before in Newfoundland, and I think was 10 points ahead of the Liberal vote. This was an astounding revolution, and it all came, of course, after Mr. Wells and I had resigned, and Joey had said he was firing me for improper activities, and Clyde Wells went back, he was going back to practice law in any event. But all of those events had gone on. And so finally, when he was forced to call an election, now the popular vote swung amazingly very high for the PCs, but because of gerrymandering, because the St. John seats, who should have had double the number of voters that they had, but they didn't have because they were suspected of having PC tendencies. Despite the fact that the PC Party won a large percentage of the popular vote, in seats it was almost a tie. It was a 20, and Tom member
Burgess.
for Labrador, Tom
Burgess?
Tom Burgess was elected. He'd fallen out with Joey in the Liberal Party, and he ran as an independent in Labrador and got elected in Labrador. And then the bidding competition started for him, because immediately he was visited by John C. Doyle, taken on his plane to St. John's to see whether he could be persuaded to now go with the Liberal Party again and run for the leadership, which they persuaded him eventually to do. But he was seen by Moores as well, but Moores wouldn't give him the same kind of promises. So all of this business went on, and then the member for the Goulds, Shea, he crossed the floor, said he wouldn't be sitting with the Tories, although he's elected a Tory. He was going to sit with the Liberals because he'd been promised a cabinet seat, and he'd been elected as a potative cabinet minister and wasn't going to stay with the PCs just as a backbencher. So all of this kind of terrible business went on, and nobody was sure who, because it was tied with Burgess. When you took out the speaker's vote, it was uncertain who really could maintain a majority in the House of Assembly. So anyway, the Lieutenant Governor did call on Moore to form a government. After Joey's appealing 6 of the close races, he lost them all. And that was when the famous district of St. Barb South, when they had a recount there was only 7 votes in the difference between Ed Maynard, the PC candidate, and the Liberal who had run there. And when they opened the ballot box to count the ballots, at the following the usual procedure, lo and behold, there were no ballots in the ballot box. And so the Liberals took a legal action to have the court declare that this election was void, so that they could get a by-election going and put off the evil day when they were going to have to give up control of the House of Assembly. So that was just some of the shenanigans that went on. But what had happened, of course, as the deputy returning officer explained, he said it was a cold night and a cold day in St. Barb South, and they had counted the ballots, and both parties had agents there, and the vote was exactly what they reported. But after they counted them all, and the Liberal agent and PC agent certified that they had, they were getting cold and the fire had gone out. So they took the ballots and stuffed them in the fire to keep the fire going. This is the explanation. Gee, anywhere but, I mean, it could only happen in Newfoundland, right? And the story that went around was that the returning officer and the people counting the ballot had got mixed up. Rather than Joey having been reported as saying that the Newfoundland people, fishermen and so on, should all leave the fishery, they should burn their boats, that they got confused. They thought he said burn their votes. This was the story that went around. Well, it was wild and woolly, but there were some humorous moments.
Brian Peckford.
Well, Brian was he was young and dynamic and a school teacher. I first met him when I was going around. Joey had said there was going to be a leadership contest, and he wasn't going to lead the party into the next election, and they were going to have a great democratic convention to select a new leader, and the party. He's going to see that the Newfoundland Liberal Party was the most democratic party ever organized, and every member of the executive would be elected, and they would elect, when there was a leadership convention, each district would send 30, elect 30 to go to the convention. Now, up to this time, every Liberal candidate from 1949 till then in Newfoundland was selected by Smallwood himself. He appointed all candidates for the Liberal Party, provincially and federally. The federal government was so cowed by Smallwood, including the great Trudeau, that they allowed him to decide who the 7 federal candidates would be in Newfoundland in every election. And if Joe decided he couldn't be a candidate, that was it. Now this was all supposedly going to be changed and a great new Democratic Party formed. And they were having elections in each district to select the executive, the forms of the new district association. So I decided, and now having been on the outs in Smallwood and at war with him, and having made my mind up that it was either him or me, we weren't both going to survive in Newfoundland politics, I went to all the opening meetings to attend to see who was getting elected to lead the party in these districts. And they would invite me. I thought there'd be a lot more hostility, but they all were interested and wanted to give me a break, a chance, and encourage me to run by allowing me to speak at these meetings. So after 8 or 10 occasions, when Smallwood, who was supposed to be the only one speaking at these meetings, and they had invited me to speak, after 8 or 10 of those incidents, Smallwood had the party pass a new rule that only the the leader of the party, who was Joe, could speak at these meetings. I mean, this is how democratic it all was, you know. And then later on he attempted to cancel his promise to have a leadership convention the next year, but I won't get into all the details.
You draft Peckford to be your organizer in that writing.
Yeah, well, I met Brian Peckford at the meeting in his district, Green Bay, and was impressed by him, and he got elected, I think, as president of the association at that meeting. So this was obviously the type that you wanted to try to impress, and you would need, when the battle went on, to vote for the new leader. So Brian and I seemed to get along together, and I appointed him as my organizer for that area in central Newfoundland, and he did a great job. He was very active and full of ideas and energy. So that's where I first met him. Was
he the wild colonial boy then?
Well, you couldn't tell that early, but he certainly was like that when he became, premier. He was very difficult to get on with, very determined. And when I became a federal minister, elected from Newfoundland and representing Newfoundland in the federal government, I found him very difficult because he was determined to have his own way in everything. I mean, Brian turned out to be the type that if I, as a minister from Newfoundland, had got him $1 billion for some huge developments in Newfoundland on Monday, he'd be attacking me on Tuesday because I didn't get another $1 billion the next day. He was very difficult to play with. You couldn't get along with him. So we clashed and had our falling out. But I'm not saying I think he was a good premier. He was honest, no question about his honesty and nature, hard-working, but very difficult. He must have his own way, But he was a good premier, I thought.
Well, speaking of somebody who wants to have their own way, what about Clyde Wells?
Yeah, well, Clyde, of course, was a very able person, and he and I, in Smallwood's cabinet, when we had our first meetings, I didn't know Clyde until that time. The only one, in addition to myself, who ever asked Smallwood a question or raised a query or whether something should be done or not, or wanted to get more control over Doyle and Shaheen, who by that time were completely associated and tied up with Joey, and Joey was giving them all the concessions that they could dream of. Clyde was opposed to that, as I was, and he and I were the only two in the cabinet would ask questions about this, and Smallwood, knowing he had to try to placate some of the younger members, including Alec Hickman, in his new cabinet, he appointed a special committee of four of us, Alec Hickman, Clyde Wells and myself, and Les Curtis, to keep an eye on us, who had been his Attorney General since 1949, and whose firm did all the legal work for Shaheen and Doyle and everyone who was seeking concessions from the government. I mean, conflict of interest was an unknown concept in Newfoundland at that time, or if it was known about, it was ignored. And that was the way it was. Well, Clyde was independent, intelligent, and not the type that was running around trying to curry favor. So naturally, my opinion when he and I took a stand on the conditions that Joey wanted, the advances of the interim financing Joey wanted to give Shaheen, my estimation of him certainly was extremely high, and he stuck it out with me, and we both resigned, and we had our differences when he became premier.
I want to ask you about that in the couple of moments we have left. When I think of Clyde Wells being determined, I think of him being stubborn.
Oh yeah, stubborn.
And in principle.
Right.
And I think of Meech Lake.
When Clyde got elected leading the Liberals, I called him that night. I was a federal minister then, and the Newfoundland House of Assembly had already passed legislation approving the Meech Lake Agreement. And we had the legislature had actually approved and adopted it. And then when Clyde got the premiership, he made noises that he was going to ask the House of Assembly to reverse this legislation. And at that time, we were trying to get the offshore, who controlled the offshore oil and gas resources off our east coast. And the battle had gone on with Trudeau for 10 or 12 years. So I called him to say, now look, Clyde, for God's sake, you know, this difference about offshore jurisdiction over oil and gas has been going on for 10 or 15 years, and we got to settle. The Mulroney government is prepared to go ahead and with a deal with the provincial government, who he was now leading. And I said, you know, if you're going to do this, the enmity that's going to be aroused in the Quebec caucus may make it impossible for this to go on to fruition. You're endangering the whole economic future of Newfoundland insofar as control over the offshore oil and gas resources are concerned. But well, Clyde said, look, you know, this is too important. It's too important, a constitutional issue, and I can't change my mind on it. I think it's wrong, and that was his position. You couldn't shake him. Luckily, when Clyde got in power, his Minister of Resources turned out to be a reasonable fellow, and the deal did get put together and accepted later by both. But I had to make them, if I do say so myself, the best, most convincing speech I ever made to the PC Federal Caucus when the legislation came up before them. Mulroney put it off for a year, because he didn't want them to be too hot under the collar to give time to pass. And then we had a caucus meeting on it, and I had to speak at that meeting in favor of going ahead with the legislation to put this arrangement in place. And I must say, I really went all out, and I said, look here, if you're sore, you know, about what's happened in Newfoundland, if you want to refuse to pass this legislation now because of what Clyde has done on Meech Lake, who are you going to hurt? The only ones you're going to hurt is me. I'm finished, right, politically. I'll never get elected again in Newfoundland. The Tories will never get elected again in Newfoundland, so this would be damn foolish behavior. So I had to ask you, and Brian Mulroney, this is why I'm so fond of Brian Mulroney. Brian Mulroney stuck with us the whole way through. And so we got it through the caucus. Even the members from Quebec voted they're okay, go ahead with it. And that's how we happened to get this accord that's given us so many hundreds of millions of dollars since.
Mr. Crosbie, we're out of time. I'm only halfway through the list of names I wanted to ask you about.
Sure.
If you're agreeable, we'll take a short break and we'll resume part 2 of the Crosbie conversation.
Sure.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.